The morning of the call, there were 19 graks nobody wanted. They stood in the far pen at the back of the Ironmaw stockade, the pen reserved for what the herdmaster politely called surplus and everyone else called slaughter meat. And they were the kind of fin that made warriors look away, not out of pity, because orcs did not deal in pity, but out of disgust, as though the animals had failed at something they should have managed on their own. Their hip bones stood up under loose hide like tent poles. Their hides had gone dull and patchy, the color of dried mud. One of them leaned against the rail because standing straight cost more than she had. They had come off an abandoned outpost, 2 valleys over, a herd left to fend on scorched pasture through a brutal summer, and by the time the warband claimed them, there was not much left to claim. The warriors and hunt captains had already come and gone, filling their pens with the fat and the sound. What remained was the leftover, the discount, the bones for broth. And into that pen, on a morning in late summer, with dust hanging in the air like something the sky had given up on, walked an orc girl, not yet 17, with a claim token in her hand and no particular expression on her face. Her name was Dela Ror, and she had been back in Ironmaw territory for exactly 11 weeks. She stood at the rail and looked at those 19 graks for a long time without saying anything, longer than seemed reasonable. She watched not the fattest of the poor lot, but the ones who held themselves square, who watched her back with clear eyes, who stood in the middle of the churn instead of pressing into the corners, and then she raised her token and claimed all of them for less than the price of a single good bowl. Somebody laughed. It was Varn Kragmaw, who ran the largest hunting operation on the North Ridge, and had never in his life passed up a chance to say what he thought. Broad through the shoulders, thick through the neck, a scar running from his left tusk to his brow, earned at Kesser Ridge. He carried his war axe the way other men carried opinions, always and heavy. He looked at the graks, and he looked at Dela, and he said, loud enough to carry, that the girl had just traded good labor for 19 head of dog scraps, and that the ground she was putting them on would not feed a rat, and that the whole business would be over by first snow. He had meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. If this kind of story is one you find yourself pulled into, the slow kind, where the person everybody counted out turns out to have been counting on something the rest of them could not see, then welcome. This channel is Orc Girl Tales, and it is brand new. We tell stories of the ones who were mocked, overlooked, and underestimated in a world that worships strength. Subscribe now and tap the bell so you do not miss what comes next. And leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. Now let us go back. Dela Ror had not come home because she had a plan. She had come because her grandmother died in the spring and there was no one else to see to the place, and because the life she had been building in a border settlement, an apprenticeship with a human tanner, had come apart quietly, the way a rope frays before it breaks. She was 17, slight for an orc, narrow shoulders, a jaw that lacked the heavy set her kinsman prized, muted olive-green skin, dark hair cut short and uneven by her own hand. She moved with a contained stillness that larger orcs mistook for timidity, and that was the precise opposite, the stillness of someone who had learned that being underestimated was useful. Her tusks were small, Her hands were calloused. Her eyes missed nothing. She held no rank in the Ironmaw. Not warrior, not shaman, not hunter, not smith. In the hierarchy that governed every breath of orc life, war chief, war captains, shamans, warriors, hunters, craftsmen, and at the bottom the ones called useless, Dela occupied a position so low it did not have a name. The territory she inherited sat at the far edge of Ironmaw land, 3 hours' walk from the nearest gathering fire, 400 acres of which maybe 80 were grazing ground, the rest being stone and steep draws and thorn thickets. The shelter was old stone, square to the weather. The stock pen leaned east, bowing to the same wind everything out there bowed to. The clan called this ground the Dead Edge. Her grandmother, Ruth, had run graks on that place her whole long life. Never many, never fat, but always some. Through droughts and freezes and blight seasons and the years the clan moved north for war and left the old ones behind. The Ironmaw regarded Ruth the way you regard an old tree that ought to have come down years ago, but somehow keeps leafing out. When Dela was small, she had spent summers here, trailing behind the old woman through the pastures, while Ruth said almost nothing and pointed at things with a chin lifted a quarter-inch. And Dela had absorbed a great deal in those silences, without knowing she was absorbing anything at all. Standing in the empty shelter the week after the burial, with the fences rotting and the pastures gone rank with neglect, something in Dela settled instead of scattered. She was not going to give it up. She did not fully know why. She only knew that when she looked at that overgrown ground, where everyone saw a burden, she felt the quiet of a place waiting to be understood. The first thing she did, before she claimed a single animal, was read. In the stone alcove beneath a grinding slab, there was a sealed hide box full of records. Not Ruth's. Her grandfather's, an orc named Ror, dead 30 years, whom Dela had never met. Dozens of bone tablets and cured leather strips spanning decades, filled in a careful hand with daily weather, the state of the grass, the movement of the herd from field to field, and long stretches of observation that read less like a herder's log than like the field notes of someone studying a thing he loved and could not stop watching. Dela sat on the cold floor and read them for 3 days. Most of it she did not grasp at first, but one phrase ran through the later tablets like a stitch through cloth, appearing again and again beside notes about which fields fared best in dry years. Gardruk Thal, the ground remembers. And near the back of the last tablet, on a leather strip dated the summer before Gorth died, a single line set apart from everything else, scratched deep. The thin ones off the poor ground are the ones worth having if you know how to read them. Tell Ruth. Ruth was dead, but the line stayed. And Dela copied it into the front of a fresh notebook of her own, scraped leather sheets bound with cord, because she had begun, without deciding to keep one. There was one person left who might explain it. Mara, her grandmother's older sister, 89, living alone in a stone hut at the edge of the nearest settlement. In her time she had been the one everyone said understood herds better than Ruth, though she had given it up decades ago when her mate died. Mara was not easy to draw out. She wore old warriors' leathers because they lasted, said perhaps a tenth of what she was thinking, and regarded her great-niece's return with an expression that gave away nothing. Dela brought the last tablet, set it on the table, pointed at the underlined line. Mara looked at it for a long time. Then she said that Gorth had spent his life proving something nobody wanted to believe, that a grok that stayed alive on bad ground was telling you the truth about herself, and that truth was worth more than fat. Fat you could put on any animal with enough grain. What you could not buy was an animal whose body had already sorted itself out, that could turn poor grass into flesh and not fall apart the first hard year. He had built his whole herd from the cull pens, she said. The rejects, the too thin, because that was where the tough ones ended up when they came off ground that had killed everything soft. She slid the tablet back across the table, the ones standing in the middle of the pen, not the corners. Those are the ones. That was the whole of the advice. It was enough. So Dela had gone to the cull, and she had done exactly what Mara told her, and she had claimed all 19, while Varn laughed. She did not argue. She had learned that arguing with a man like Varn was like arguing with weather. She only said, when he was done, that she would let him know how it went. Flatly, without heat. She walked her 19 bony graks in 2 trips to the dead edge and turned them loose into belly-high grass full of weeds and wild forage that a tidier herder would have cleared years ago. The graks put their heads down and began to eat. Dela stood at the fence in the last August light and made her first entry. She wrote the date. She wrote, 19 head. She did not name them. Mara had said you did not name what you might have to sell. She almost held that line, but there was one, red-brown hide, pale slash across her flank, who had been the first to walk toward Dela at the rail, and the last to look away. Within a week, Dela was calling her the captain. By month's end, she had written it down. The work of that first autumn was slow and unglamorous and invisible to nearly everyone. She mended fences in the order the tablets suggested, starting with the fields marked as the ones that came back first after a dry spell. She moved the graks from field to field on a rotation she worked out from the records, never letting them strip a pasture to dirt, always pulling them off while green still stood, and the rested fields came back thicker and deeper rooted than anyone believed that ground could grow. Nobody in the Ironmaw understood this. Hunters passing through the dead edge saw empty fields beside grazed ones and shook their heads, the girl herds like a child playing house. Dela did not explain. She had learned that explaining was a form of asking permission, and she was done asking. By early winter, the difference was showing. The 19 bony animals had changed, hides thick and glossy, tent pole hips softened under good flesh, laid on nothing but grass and rest and clean water and patient rotation recorded to the day. The captain grew broad and sleek. Then Borag came. Varn's shadow, thick-necked, shaved head, the confidence of a man who had never formed an original thought, but had access to a louder man's opinions. He said the war chief was considering this land for hunting grounds, that 19 head of cull stock were not a sufficient reason to hold it. You are wasting territory, he said. This territory was not being used. I am using it. When Dela did not move, Borag kicked the nearest fence section. The crossbar snapped. 2 graks bolted through the gap. Fences break, he said, and left. Dela spent that evening chasing graks and that night repairing fence by torchlight. In her notebook, fence broken. Repaired. Nothing else. The ones who noticed eventually were the men at Elias's trading post. the deer-hide tent where the clan's hunters gathered around the fire pit to trade gossip. They noticed Dela because Varn had told the CULL story, embellished each time, and it had become a small comedy. The girl who traded labor for dog scraps. When she came for supplies, they went quiet the way men go quiet when they have been talking about you. Borag would ask how her rats were doing. The others would grin. Dela bought what she came for and answered plainly. Once, when Borag asked if she had buried any yet, she said, "Not yet," in a tone so level it took the fun out of the question. Elias, the old tanner who had known 3 generations of roars, watched without comment. But once, as she was leaving, he said almost to himself that her grandfather used to buy that same stock, and that people had laughed at him too. Then he took her payment and said nothing more. Dela wrote it in her notebook that night. The first time anyone in the Ironmaw had said her grandfather's name, as though it meant something. Part 2 is coming. The first winter, the calves that changed everything, and the taste that rewrote the rules. If you are already here, subscribe to Orc Girl Tales and tap the bell. Leave a comment. Which moment stayed with you? The 19 in the pen? The captain's name? Part 2 is on its way. Winter came hard that year, the way it did every 3rd or 4th year in those hills. A stretch of days when the cold never broke, and the wind came off the ridges like something with intention. This was the season that killed graks, and the season the Ironmaw waited to see Dela's herd die in. Varn Kragmaw said as much to anyone who would listen. The girl's experiment would be settled by the thaw. 19 frozen carcasses on the dead edge. To prove it. But Dela had read the tablets, and the tablets were full of winters. Her grandfather had written again and again that animals bred on hard ground wintered easiest because their bodies had never learned to depend on ease. They carried less fat, but burned it slower. Their hides grew thicker. They knew where to shelter before the weather told them to move. And Dela wintered her herd the old way, feeding hay she had cut from the rested fields, stacking it in the sheltered draws where the wind could not reach, walking out every morning through snow to break ice on the water and count heads. Every morning, in the dark, in the deepest week of that killing winter, the wolves came. Not ordinary wolves. Blight wolves. Gaunt, desperate, pushed from their own territory by dying ground, 7 of them, gray and silent, sliding through the fence line in the hours before dawn. Dela heard the graks first, a low bellow, not a stampede, but the sound of animals pressing together, shoulder to shoulder, facing outward. The instinct of prey that has decided to stand. She ran out with a torch and found the captain at the front of the herd, broad head lowered, horns forward, blocking the gap. 2 graks behind her had pushed their calves to the center of the ring. The wolves circled, but did not charge. The captain held the line. Dela drove them off with fire. She did not lose a single animal. In her notebook, wolves, 7. Herd losses, 0. Captain held the line. The clan's main herds, kept in the open pastures closer to the gathering fires, lost 11 graks that same night. The wolves had found easier prey where the animals were softer and the herders slower to wake. The Ironmaw called it bad luck. Dela called it nothing. She mended her fence and moved on. The herd came through winter. Every one. They came through with thick hides and clear eyes, and when the thaw broke and the grass began to green in the low field, 5 of them were visibly bred, because Dela had run a rented bull with them in autumn, on the strength of a line in the tablets about not waiting to see if an animal would prove herself before you let her breed. By late spring there were calves, 9, more than the 5 she had been sure of, because 4 others had taken to the bull as well, born easy in the good spring grass, without Dela having to assist a single one. Sound, straight-legged, bright-eyed calves that stood and nursed within the hour. Dela sat on the top rail and watched them find their legs in the wet green of the low field. She wrote, 9 calves, no losses, and sat there a while longer than the entry required. She had done in 9 months, on ground everyone said would not feed a rat, with animals everyone said were dog scraps, what better supplied operations in the Ironmaw failed to do in years. She had let the animals do what animals do. On grass, she had learned to grow the way her grandfather grew it. The results were standing in the field, nursing their mothers. She did not tell anyone. She was not built to advertise. She let the fact of the calves make its own way into the world, which it did slowly, through the trading post and the water source and the gathering fire, until, by early summer, it was generally known that the Ror girls' dog Scraps had dropped 9 live calves and lost none. This was received with a grudging silence that was, for that crowd, the loudest thing they knew how to say. That summer she began to sell. Not the graks and not the calves, but the beginning of an idea that had been forming since she first understood what her grandfather had actually been doing. He had not been raising common stock to sell by the pound. He had been building, generation by generation, a small herd so perfectly matched to that hard ground, so efficient at turning poor grass into good meat, that the meat itself was different. He sold it by the cut to the handful who understood the difference, old families, cooks who remembered, and once a human innkeeper 3 valleys over who bought everything Gorth could supply until the man retired and the arrangement lapsed. Dela read that entry a dozen times. Then she took the captain's first bull calf, along with 2 others raised entirely on grass, and had them slaughtered at the cutting house in the next settlement. She brought home the wrapped cuts and cooked a steak on the old stone hearth that ran hot. And she understood, chewing, what her grandfather had meant. It did not taste like market meat. It tasted like the ground it came from, deep and clean and particular. The taste of an animal that had eaten nothing but diverse, deep-rooted forage its whole, slow life. She wrote 1 word in her notebook, underlined it the way her grandfather underlined the things that mattered. Different, built different, she would say later to the first buyers who asked. And it became, without her intending it, the name the whole enterprise went by, though she never made a sign. The first person she sold to was Elias, almost by accident. She mentioned while buying salt that she had meat and more than she could eat. Elias looked at her over his work, named a price higher than she would have dared to ask, and paid in trade stones without discussion. A week later he came to the dead edge himself, which no one had done. They walked the fields in the low light of an autumn evening. At the far end of the rested pasture, Elias stopped. He crouched down and pushed his fingers into soil that had not been grazed to dirt in over a year. He came up with a handful of black, crumbly earth laced with roots. He held it in his open palm, and looked at it for a long time. Then he said that, in 40 years of watching the Ironmaw graze its land to death, he had not seen soil like that outside the river bottoms, and that Dela's grandfather used to bring him handfuls of it, just like that, and hold it out just like that, and say that the ground remembered how to be good ground if you would only stop punishing it and give it time. The ground remembers, the phrase from the tablets, spoken aloud by a living man who had heard it from the dead. 1. Dela felt something turn over in her chest. She did not have a word for. Elias let the soil fall back. He said the meat was the best he had eaten since her grandfather quit selling, and that people would ask where he got it. Did she care if he told them? She did not care. She said it plainly, and Elias told people, not with fanfare, the way a good trader tells things, dropping it into conversation, mentioning to the right buyer at the right moment that if they wanted real meat, the Ror girl on the dead edge had it, raised the old way, better than anything the provisioners sold. Dear, yes. Worth it, yes. It moved through the Ironmaw the way the dog scrap story had moved, along the same invisible channels, only now the story had inverted. The thing everyone laughed at had quietly become the thing everyone was curious about. By autumn, Dela had a list of names in the back of her notebook. She sold every cut from 3 animals and had orders she could not fill. She raised her prices. Nobody balked. She wrote the value she had earned from 3 animals bred from a herd she had claimed for less than the price of 1. Looked at the figure, closed the notebook, went out to check the water trough because ice was forming and the work did not stop because the numbers had gotten good. If you are still here, if you can feel the weight of a notebook filling with small, stubborn victories on ground the world wrote off, then you understand what this channel is about. Subscribe to Orc Girl Tales if you have not already. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been the person nobody believed in? The second winter was easier, not because it was milder, but because Dela knew what she was doing. The herd had grown to nearly 40 head. She wintered them the same careful way, and lost none. And it was in that second winter that Varn Kragmaw came to the dead edge. He did not come to apologize. Men like Varn did not apologize. They came to see for themselves, to settle a thing that had been working at them from a distance. He came on a cold, clear day. He stood at the fence, arms crossed, his war axe resting against the post, not on his shoulder, where it always was. That meant something. Dela noticed and chose not to remark on it. He looked at the herd standing sleek in the sheltered draw, feeding on hay Dela was forking out. They look good, he said. From Varn Kragmaw, that was an admission of magnitude. Dela understood exactly what it cost him. She kept forking hay, said thank you, asked if he wanted to walk out. He did. He climbed the fence and walked the frozen field with her. He looked at the graks up close, the descendants of the animals he had called dog scraps. He ran his hand along the captain's broad back and felt the condition on her. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had been running herds in the Ironmaw for 31 years and that his ground got poorer every season, no matter what he did, and that he had come out here expecting to find her failing, and instead he was standing on grass in deep winter that was better than his in high summer. He said it not as praise, but his grievance against the order of things. A man discovering the rules he had built his life on had been the wrong rules. Dela said it was mostly her grandfather's doing, and that she had just read what he left. Varn asked to see the tablets. She showed him. He never told anyone at the trading post he had been wrong. Borag went on asking about rats for months before he noticed the joke had died and Varn was not laughing anymore. But Varn came back in the spring with a proposal. He would fence off his worst 40 acres, the eroded corner that grew nothing but ragweed and regret, rest it, rotate it the way the tablets laid out, buy 4 bred graks from Dela's herd. Full price. He wanted her to come once a month and tell him what he was doing wrong. Dela said she would let him know. Took a week. Said yes, because she had read another line in the tablets. A thing you keep to yourself dies with you. A thing you teach outlives you. She sold Varn 4 graks, noted it without ceremony, but sat with it a moment longer than the entry required, because she knew what it was. The chief skeptic, converted, paying full price, asking to be taught. She had said on the day of the call that she would let him know how it went. She had let him know. She had not needed to say a word. And then the dead edge was tested one more time. Early spring, first green showing in the low fields. Dela woke to the sound of breaking wood. Deliberate, not wind. 3 sections of her north fence destroyed. Fresh boot marks, the water cistern filled with rubble, stones shoved in from the rim, and on the stock-sheltered door scratched deep with a blade, dead-edged eyes. Borag. Dela stood in the dark looking at the words. Somewhere in the draws a grak bellowed, lost and frightened. She did not sit down. She did not cry. She wrote, fence destroyed, 3 sections, cistern fouled, herd scattered. She spent 2 days rounding up graks, rebuilding fence, clearing the cistern stone by stone. Her hands bled. She did not wrap them until the fence was finished. On the 3rd night she came back from the far draw with the last stray grak and found Varn Kragmaw sitting on the top rail of her repaired fence. No axe, no escort, just an old warrior on a fence post in the dark. Heard about the fence, Varn said. Dela penned the grak. It will not happen again, Varn said. It did not happen again. Whatever Varn said or did, Dela never learned. She did not ask. In her notebook, 3 days after the attack, beneath the damage report, a single line. Fence holds. She underlined it. Part 3 is coming, and it brings the Blight, the season that killed everything the Ironmaw had built, except the ground the girl on the dead edge had been quietly teaching to remember. Subscribe to Orc Girl Tales so you do not miss it. The final chapter changes everything. Word of Varn Kragmaw's conversion did what Dela's success alone could not, because Varn was the Ironmaw, the loudest voice, the largest presence, and when he quietly began doing what the Ror girl did, resting his worst ground, rotating his graks, letting the grass grow deep before he let animals touch it, and when he quietly began producing meat people could taste the difference in, the whole shape of what was possible shifted in the clan's imagination. Other men came to the dead edge, older orcs mostly, the ones who had been grazing ground into dust their whole lives and had a bad feeling about where it was headed. They came the way men come to a thing they are half ashamed of needing, with their pride held in front of them like a shield. Dela walked them through her fields. She showed them the soil in her open hand, the same gesture Elias had described, the same gesture her grandfather had made. Black, root-laced earth held out like proof of something you have spent your life being told is not real. She let them push their own fingers into the sod. She never charged for the walking. Several bought graks. One of them, an old orc named Cyrus Bone Axe, poorest territory in the Ironmaw, deepest debts, bought 2 bread graks on credit. Dela extended quietly because he reminded her of the way the tablets talked about her grandfather in his lean years. She never spoke of that arrangement. He paid it back in 18 months and named a grag after her, which embarrassed them both. A young orc named Del, who hauled water for Elias's trading post, started coming to the dead edge on rest days, quiet, serious, willing to work. Dela paid him in food and teaching. By summer's end, he could read a pasture nearly as well as she could, and Dela saw, watching him crouch to push fingers into the sod, the way she had learned from Elias, who had learned from Gorth, the thing her grandfather had meant about outliving yourself. Knowledge passing from a dead man through tablets through her hands into a boy who would carry it into a generation her grandfather never saw. She wrote no entry about this. Some things did not fit in notebooks, but the thing that changed everything, that took a girl's quiet success on the dead edge and turned it into something the whole region would talk about, was the Blight. It came in the 4th year, and it was the worst dying the Ironmaw had seen in living memory. A killing that started in the month of new growth, when the spring rains did not come, and deepened through a white sky season of heat that cracked the ground and dried the streams to stone. The shamans called it a curse. They burned offerings, red bones, said the spirits were angry. The truth was simpler and harder to fix. The ground was exhausted. 3 generations of the Ironmaw had taken from it and put nothing back. They had grazed it to the roots every summer, stripped the cover every autumn, let the topsoil blow every winter, and blamed the spirits when the grass came back thinner until it did not come back at all. The Blight was not magic. It was arithmetic, the kind that accumulates silently for decades and then presents its bill at once. By midsummer, the Ironmaw was dying. The herds that had been pushed hard on overgrazed ground for generations had nothing to fall back on. No deep roots, no reserve. The grass that had been grazed to dirt every summer of its life simply gave up and browned and blew away. And the herders who had laughed at the girl with the dog scraps began in midsummer and then in a flood in late summer to sell, dumping graks onto a collapsing market at whatever they could get because they could not feed them, hauling gaunt animals to the same cull pens at the same stockade where Dela had stood 4 years before, and watching their life's work sell for bones for broth prices. Varn sold 1/3 of his main herd, not the rested 40, those held, but the rest of his territory grazed the old way for 31 years, turned brown and dead. The whole territory turned brown. The whole territory, except for the fields at the end of the 3-hour trail, the dead edge, the ground nobody wanted. 400 acres of hill country that old Ruth had run graks on, and old Gorth had written tablets about, and a girl of 17 had walked into with 19 bony animals, and a notebook she had not yet started filling. Except for Varn's rested 40, except for Cyrus Bone Axe's poor corner, fenced and rotated, except for the scattered patches growing more numerous each year, where somebody had listened to the Ror girl and begun to work the land the way her grandfather had worked it, letting it keep its cover, resting it, building the deep-rooted sod that in a normal year merely grew better grass and in a blight year did the thing that saved them, which was to hold water in the ground like a sponge and stay green when everything around it died. Dela's pasture stayed green. It was the strangest thing anyone had seen. People walked the 3-hour trail just to look at it, the way you walk to see a thing that should not be. A green island in a brown territory. 400 acres of hill ground standing in midsummer grass, while the fat lowland pastures blew away in dust. Her graks, the sleek descendants of the 19 bony animals nobody had wanted, grazed through the worst blight in 100 years without losing condition, without Dela buying a bale of hay or a bag of feed, drinking from a spring in the deep draw that her grandfather's tablets noted had never gone dry, because the recharge came from ground that held its water. And Dela moved them field to field on the same patient rotation she had kept from the start. And she wrote in her notebook, in the driest week of that terrible summer, the count of her herd and a single word: green. And she underlined it. And the men who had laughed, the ones still standing, understood at last what they had been looking at all along. Varn stood at her fence one white evening in late summer and looked out at the impossible green. His war axe was not on his shoulder. It was nowhere. For the first time in Dela's memory, Varn had come without it, as though the thing he had carried his whole life to signal who he was no longer said what he needed it to say. "You were right," he said, plainly, the way she had taught him, by example, to say hard things without production. "You were right, and I was wrong. And your grandfather was right 30 years before that. And this whole clan spent 3 generations laughing at the 2 people who understood the one thing that mattered." Dela stood beside him and did not say anything for a while. The evening light moved across the green field and stopped at the brown line where her territory ended and dead ground began. The contrast was so sharp it looked like a border drawn by a careful hand. Then she said that her grandfather had written that the ground remembered, and that she supposed the ground had remembered a good deal longer than any of them had. She had been right. She usually was. She did not say so. The green field said it for her, all the way to the brown horizon. That autumn, when rains returned and the Ironmaw began counting its losses, the demand for Dela's graks and knowledge outstripped anything she could supply. This was the moment where a different person would have made a different mistake. She could have claimed more territory, bought more animals, scaled up into the kind of operation Varn had built, and come to regret. The war chief himself had sent a messenger. The first time the Dead Edge had received official attention in 3 generations. But Dela had read the whole of her grandfather's tablets, twice, and she had understood the deepest thing in them, which was not about grass or graks, but about patience. Gorth had never borrowed to grow faster than the land could grow. He let demand pull the operation forward instead of pushing it with debt. He added a field only when the herd was ready, and graks only when the ground could feed them, so that when the hard years came, and they always came, he owed nothing and could ride them out on the strength of the land. So Dela grew the way he had grown. She added the next 40 acres the year after the blight, buying outright from a herder whose stock the drought had ruined. She rested that new ground a full year before she grazed it. She added graks only as fast as her own herd bred them. The buyer list grew until it was a book of its own, and a human innkeeper from the border town 3 valleys over, the same town where the establishment her grandfather had once supplied, had been, rode out one day, having heard of the green pasture and the built different meat. He tasted it and began an arrangement the tablets would have recognized. The circle had closed. The same route, the same kind of buyer, the same quality, separated by 30 years and a generation of forgetting, connected by tablets and a girl who read them on a cold stone floor and understood. Del brought her something, one evening that autumn, a bundle wrapped in hide, inside, a set of bone tablets he had carved himself, copying her method, weather, grass height, herd movement, rotation. Figured somebody ought to keep a second set, he said, in case. He did not say in case of what. Tablets burned. People died. Knowledge disappeared. Dela looked at the tablets, at the boy who made them. She said his grass height notations needed work, and he was overestimating the south field by at least a hand's width. Del grinned. It was the closest Dela came to saying she was proud. Mara lived long enough to see it. She was 93 the autumn the Blight broke. Dela brought her to the dead edge on a slow walk. The old woman in worn warrior's leathers, leaning on a staff that had once been a spear shaft. They stood together at the fence in the light. The green fields, the sleek herd, Del in the far pasture, moving graks with quiet competence. The captain, old now, broad and slow, grazing in the home field with the unhurried dignity of an animal who had earned the right to take her time. Mara did not say much. She never had. But she reached out and put her hand on the top rail. The same fence Ruth had leaned on, Gorth had built, Dela had replaced plank by plank, and looked out over the ground for a long time. And she said that Gorth would have liked to see this, that he had known it would come, that he had told her once, near the end he was not worried about the knowledge dying with him, because the ground would keep it, and someday the right person would come back and read what the ground had to say. Dela said she supposed she had been the one to come back. Mara looked at her. Something moved in the old face, the face that had spent 93 years saying a tenth of what it thought. Not quite a smile. The place where a smile might be built if someone kept laying the foundation. Those are the ones, she said, what she had said 4 years ago about the graks. And Dela understood she meant something larger now. She meant Dela herself. She had known, that first afternoon when a girl with no plan laid a tablet on her table, exactly what she was looking at. Mara died the following spring, quietly, in her sleep. Dela buried her beside Ruth and Gorth on the hill, the 3 of them together. The 2 who understood, and the 2 who were laughed at, though those were the same 2. And Mara, who saw it all and said almost none of it, and carried the knowledge in her silence, the way the ground carried water in its roots. Dela stood at the graves in the spring light with the green territory rolling below, greener now than in generations, because she was not the only one anymore. And she felt the weight of it, the triumph and the grief bound together, the way they always are, because the ones who would have been proudest were the ones who were not there to see. She named a grak for Mara that spring, out of the captain's line. The captain herself, grown old, grazing out her last easy years in the home field, unsold. The one animal Dela had promised would never leave. She wrote the name in her notebook, Mara, beside the date, without ceremony. And then she wrote something beneath it, a line of her own, the first line she had written that was not a count or a weather note or a record of the herd. The ground remembers. And she underlined it once, the way the two who came before her had underlined the things that mattered, so that, someday, when she was the old one, when whoever came back to this place opened these pages the way she had opened her grandfather's, they would find the phrase waiting for them, handed down. Still true. The morning she made that entry, there were, by her count, 140 graks grazing the green fields of a territory the whole Ironmaw had once agreed was not worth the trouble. Descended, down to the last calf, from 19 bony animals nobody had wanted, on ground that had fed them through the worst blight in 100 years while the fat pastures turned to dust. She stood at the fence in the early light and looked at them for a long time without saying anything, longer than seemed reasonable. The way she had looked at them that first morning in the back pen of the stockade, and this time no. One laugh, because there was no one left in that territory who did not finally understand what she had seen when she looked, which was the thing that had been true all along, that the rejected thing is the valuable thing when you know how to read it, that patience beats force and attention beats power. That worth does not need to argue, because in the end it simply proves itself, and that the ground remembers. Longer than pride, longer than laughter, longer than the men who stood at the fence and called it dead, it remembers. It always does. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the weight of the notebook, the patience of the rotation, the green field standing alone in a brown world, then share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Orc Girl Tales and tap the bell for more stories of the ones who were mocked, the ones who were counted out, and the ones who proved there is more than one kind of strength. Leave a comment. Which moment stayed with you? The 19 in the pen, the captain's name, Mara's last words, the single word green, underlined, we read, every one. The next story is already on its way.